Welcome to Darkest Sleep, a space for quiet, unsettling stories to drift off to. If this kind of calm darkness helps you relax, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and just how late it is where you are tonight. Now relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When I was a much younger man, I used to drive long-haul deliveries for a furniture company based out of Denver. I mostly did routes across the mountain states, which meant a lot of empty highway and a lot of late nights with nothing but my thoughts and the hum of the diesel engine for company. Now, most guys hated the solitude, but for me, it was a time to clear my head. Besides, the money was good, and my company wasn't too strict about the exact routes I took, as long as the delivery arrived on time. This one time, I had a drop-off scheduled in a small, isolated town in Wyoming, just barely on the map. It was late November, and the first serious snow of the season had fallen, making the back roads a real pain to navigate. I was running a couple of hours behind schedule, and it was pitch black, with the kind of heavy, oppressive darkness you only get when you're 100 miles from the nearest town. I took a shortcut that was supposed to save me 20 minutes, but it turned into a narrow, winding dirt track that felt more like a deer trail than a road. About 30 minutes into this shortcut, my truck's high beams cut through the thick woods and illuminated a small, two-story house sitting about 50 yards off the road. It was one of those houses that looked like it had been dropped there 100 years ago and never touched since. The paint was gone, the porch sagged, and the whole structure tilted slightly to the side. What caught my eye, though, wasn't the decay. It was the light. In the upstairs window, the very middle window, there was a faint, steady light burning. It wasn't the electric glow of a lamp. It was a warm, yellowish, candle-like light. The kind of illumination that seemed to defy the darkness. It also made the shadows around it seem deeper. I figured it was a squatter, or maybe a very eccentric old resident who lived without power. I passed the house and forgot about it, focusing on the slick road ahead. But then, about 10 minutes later, I hit a deep pothole concealed by the snow, and the right headlight went out with a sickening crackle. I pulled over, checked the fuse box, and tried to fix the connection, but the bulb was clearly blown. Driving a big rig with only one headlight on these roads was inviting disaster. I thought about turning back, but the house was maybe a quarter-mile behind me. I decided I would walk back and ask the person with the light if I could borrow a flashlight, or even just wait in their yard for the sun to rise. I parked the rig, grabbed my heavy coat, and started walking back through the cold. When I got near the house, the silence was intense. No wind, no crickets, just the crunching of my boots on the frozen dirt. The small yellow light was still burning steadily upstairs. I walked up to the porch, which groaned under my weight, and knocked firmly on the front door. The wood was cold and gritty under my knuckles. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, a little louder. "Hello? I'm the driver of the big truck up the road." My light went out. "Could you spare a moment?" Still nothing. But I saw something then. The front door wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar, maybe half an inch, letting out a sliver of that deep, earthy smell that old houses have. I figured the resident was either asleep, hard of hearing, or maybe just out back. I didn't want to trespass, but I needed to know if someone was there. I pushed the door open just enough to stick my head inside. "Hello? Anyone home?" The main floor was instantly colder than the outside air. It was completely empty. No furniture, no dust, just bare, scuffed floorboards and walls stripped down to the lath. It was the same unnerving, total absence of life I had noticed in some genuinely abandoned places. Except for the light. The yellow glow from upstairs was noticeably brighter now, casting a flickering, elongated shadow down the stairwell. And it was accompanied by a sound, a very soft, slow, rhythmic scraping. It sounded like someone was dragging a dull tool across a wooden floor, or maybe the steady movement of an old rocking chair. The scraping sound drew me up those stairs. Every step I took caused the old wood to groan loudly, but the rhythmic scraping upstairs never stopped, never sped up, never acknowledged my presence. I reached the top of the stairs and stood in the dark hallway. There were two doors. One was closed. The other, the one where the light was coming from, was slightly pushed inward. I walked to the open door and looked inside the room. The single, small window was the source of the light. The glow didn't come from a lamp, a candle, or any modern device. It came from a circular opening, a hole cut perfectly through the wooden windowsill, facing the road. This hole focused the light and shot a thin beam of that yellowish light outside toward the highway. And sitting right in front of the window, with its back to me, was a person. They were in a high-backed wooden chair, completely motionless, their shoulders hunched. They were dressed in dark, heavy clothing that looked ancient. The rhythmic scraping noise had stopped. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need some help." The figure didn't move. I took a slow step into the room. The only source of light inside was the glow from the outside. It seemed impossible. There was no lamp, no candle, no fire, but the room was filled with this strange, focused yellow luminance. The person was leaning forward slightly. As I took another step, I saw why the light was so yellow. The beam wasn't just shining through the hole. It was passing through a small, translucent object set into the windowsill. It looked like a piece of petrified amber, the size of a fist, glowing with an internal, ethereal light. It was beautiful, yet intensely unsettling. And then, as I stood just a few feet behind the chair, the figure slowly, deliberately turned their head. It didn't turn its body, just its head, slowly pivoting on its neck until it was looking directly at me over its shoulder. The face was old, unbelievably aged, covered in a network of deep, dry wrinkles, and the eyes were wide open and completely white, like polished stone, reflecting the yellow light coming from the sill. There was no color, no iris, and no pupil. But the worst part was that the figure was not sitting in the chair. It was wired to it. A thin, dark wire was run through the back of the chair and wrapped tight around the figure's neck, holding the head up and straight. Its hands were similarly bound to the wooden armrests, keeping the posture perfectly upright. This wasn't a person resting. It was a display. As I watched, a final horrifying detail registered. The rhythmic scraping I had heard was not the figure, but a small, stiff rat's tail tied to its heavy coat, which had been slowly dragging back and forth against the wooden floorboards by some concealed, clockwork mechanism that had only just stopped. The whole thing was a grotesque, elaborate, and terrible automaton. I stumbled backward, the noise of my heel hitting the floor, a terrifying thunderclap in the silence. I didn't turn off the light. I didn't close the door. I simply fell backward down the stairs, scrambled to my feet, and ran back the way I came. I drove the rest of the night with only one headlight, squinting into the dark, but I didn't care. I made the delivery hours late, told the boss a story about an icy road, and never drove that route again. I have no idea who set up that horrible display, or what the purpose of that single focused beam of borrowed light was. I just know that out in the empty stretches of the mountains, there are places that don't want to be found, and some houses only light up to draw you in. I didn't exactly have a traditional career path. When I was a much younger man, I earned a living working for a specialized demolition company in the Northeast. We mostly handled state projects, tearing down old factories or, in one unusual case, preparing to seal off sections of the ancient subway tunnels beneath a major city that were too dangerous to use anymore. This one specific job was in a long abandoned rail spur beneath an industrial district. The spur was never completed, and the tunnel itself was only rough-cut stone and earth. It was a massive, echoing space pitch black and smelled sharply of ozone and cold, damp rock. The sheer scale of the space, swallowed by the darkness, was enough to make you feel completely insignificant. My job was to run preliminary structural scans, marking weak points and checking the long-term integrity of the stone ceiling before the city permanently sealed it. I was usually down there with one other guy, but on this particular night, my partner called in sick with a bad fever, so it was just me and my powerful helmet lamp navigating the overwhelming silence. The solitude was intense. The only sound was the faint drip of water echoing from the unseen ceiling. I was about a half-mile deep into the tunnel, past the point where the city had completely stopped its work decades ago. The polished concrete of the entrance had long given way to rough-cut granite walls, and the occasional electrical conduit completely vanished into the earth. This section was officially charted as completely empty and unfinished. That's when I heard it, a repetitive, dull clanking sound coming from further down the tunnel. It wasn't the metallic shriek of trains or modern machinery. It was the heavy, rhythmic sound of a metal tool striking stone, consistent and methodical, like someone chipping away at the granite face with a hand tool. I immediately shut off my scanning equipment. The sudden silence swallowed everything, save for that persistent, chilling sound. Clank, clank, clank. The regularity of the blows was what truly unnerved me. It was too steady, too tireless to be a human taking a break or shifting position. I shined my powerful lamp forward. The beam disappeared into the blackness, failing to reach the source of the noise. I knew the tunnel officially ended about 300 yards ahead, hitting the solid natural bedrock that was marked on all the old blueprints. There was absolutely no construction site down there, no reason for anyone to be working, let alone at 3 a.m. I felt a surge of cold curiosity override my common sense. I walked slowly, placing my boots carefully on the uneven ground. As I got closer, the clanking grew louder, and I started to feel a low, humming vibration travel up through the solace of my heavy boots. The air around me grew noticeably colder, and the ozone smell intensified to a harsh chemical bite. When I reached the spot where the tunnel was supposed to end, my lamp hit something impossible. The tunnel hadn't ended at a solid rock face. Instead, it continued onward, carved out of the natural stone by a completely different, almost brutal method. The walls here were not smoothed by drills and explosive charges. They were rough, jagged, and covered in thousands of tiny, crescent-shaped gouges, as if they had been painstakingly chipped away by hand over years. The clanking sound was coming from this extended section, and it was loud enough now to hurt my ears. And there, leaning against the rough-cut entrance to this new spur, was a makeshift cart. It was small, old, made of rusting steel and splintered wood, and piled high with chunks of freshly carved, sparkling white granite. It looked like something from an ancient gold mine, not a modern, abandoned subway project. I edged past the cart, the noise nearly overwhelming me, and shone my lamp down the new tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to pass, and it snaked away, twisting almost like a corkscrew into the impenetrable darkness. The noise was a continuous, rhythmic heavy blow, and the sharp crack of rock splintering and falling. I followed the sound and the faint wheel tracks for maybe 50 yards. Then, the tunnel abruptly opened into a small, rough-hewn cavern. The clanking stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, cold, and suffocating. I scanned the cavern slowly. It was entirely empty, save for a massive, irregular block of granite standing in the center that looked like it had been recently freed from the wall. I walked around the block, frantically looking for the worker, for the source of the impossible sound. That's when I found the figure. It was crouched low in a shallow alcove, tucked into the solid granite wall, completely motionless. It wasn't wearing construction gear or any identifiable uniform. It was dressed in heavy, dark, close-fitting clothing, almost like a full-body suit made of thick, oil-stained leather. Its head was entirely obscured by a hooded leather mask that was smooth and seamless, with no visible eye holes or seams. It still held the tool that made the sound, a massive, crude stone-cutting hammer with a head the size of a cinder block, resting on the floor. I whispered, my voice thick with dust and fear. "Who are you? This tunnel is closed. You need to identify yourself." The figure didn't move a muscle. It didn't breathe. It didn't even twitch. It remained crouched over a section of the wall where the granite looked fresh and cracked, and there was a small, clean pile of ultrafine stone dust at its feet. I took a slow step back, raising my hand in a gesture of retreat. "I'm leaving now. I'm reporting this to the city. You need to stop whatever you're doing." The figure remained absolutely frozen. Then, very slowly, a single black-gloved hand reached out and lightly traced the rough granite wall next to its crouched form. As the fingers dragged across the stone, I saw it, carved right into the rock. At my eye level was a perfectly etched date. It was today's date, followed by an impossibly long string of flowing, looping numbers that stretched across the wall for several feet. The numbers were too clean, too precise, and they looked like they had been burned into the stone rather than carved by the crude hammer. The figure slowly pulled its hand away from the wall. I saw a small wet sheen of dark, heavy oil or fluid smeared across the freshly etched numbers. Then, without any sound of effort or muscle strain, the figure raised the enormous hammer above its head. It didn't look at me. Its blank, masked face was focused entirely on the granite face before it. I didn't wait for the hammer to fall. The sheer wrongness of the scene, the date, the oil, the tireless silence broke me. I turned and ran, scrambling over the uneven stone and following the wheel tracks back toward the familiar city-cut tunnel. I ran until I burst out into the night air and didn't stop until my truck was miles away. I called the police. They sent a patrol down, but they only went as far as the city's old concrete barrier. They reported that the tunnel was too unstable to proceed and found no one. They dismissed the cart and the hand-carved section as old artifacts from a forgotten era of tunneling. I quit the job the next morning. I never went back near those tunnels. I don't know who was down there or why they were carving those smooth, impossible numbers. But I have a feeling the tunnel wasn't abandoned. It was simply being worked by someone who measured progress not in feet, but in the relentless silent ticking of that long carved count. I was driving north, looking for a break from city life, when I took on a job clearing out a remote property that belonged to a distant family friend who had recently passed away. It was a beautiful, small, wooden cabin nestled deep in the redwood forests of Northern California, a place where the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. The isolation was profound, sitting about 3 hours of twisting, unpaved roads from the nearest town. The cabin itself was built in the 1930s, simple, solid, and rustic. But the moment I arrived, I noticed something profoundly unsettling about the structure. All the windows were the original small panes, covered with faded lace curtains, except for one, on the side of the cabin facing the densest, darkest part of the old-growth woods. There was a window that had been completely and violently boarded over with rough, dark planks of wood. It was secured hastily with thick, rusty, oversized nails driven deep into the frame. I tried calling my contact about it, but the satellite phone signal was weak. When I finally reached her, she simply offered a dismissive answer. "The previous owner always kept that one closed. It lets in too much draft. Don't worry about it." Her lack of explanation only deepened my internal unease. I started my work, spending the days methodically sorting through boxes filled with decades of forgotten possessions, and the nights trying desperately to sleep in the heavy, oppressive silence. The first few nights were just cold and unnerving, punctuated only by the faint echoing calls of unseen forest creatures. But by the fourth night, I started hearing a distinct, chilling noise. It was a soft, methodical tapping sound coming from outside the cabin, always starting precisely around 2 a.m. It was too regular and too deliberate to be the wind or a branch. It was a precise, high-pitched tap, tap, tap sound, like a piece of thin metal or a heavy fingernail persistently striking glass. The rhythm was slow, but completely tireless, and it seemed to fill the entire cabin, bouncing off the wooden walls and floorboards. I knew the sound was coming from the side of the cabin with the boarded window. I got out of bed, adrenaline pumping a cold rush through my veins. The next day, I meticulously examined the window from the inside. I confirmed the external boards were secured so tightly that no one could have slipped a hand or a tool through the gap. I pulled back the old lace curtains. Behind the dark planks on the exterior, a single interior pane of glass was intact, dusty but whole. The tapping, I confirmed, had to be coming from the exterior side of the boards. That night I was prepared. I had placed my heavy flashlight and a length of fireplace poker by my bed. The tapping began exactly at 2:03 a.m. It started soft and quickly grew into a confident, constant tap, tap, tap against the wood. I waited until the sound was loud and steady. Then, moving slowly to keep the floorboards from betraying my position, I crept to the kitchen, flipped the main outdoor porch light switch, and flung open the front door. I aimed my powerful flashlight directly at the boarded window. The tapping stopped instantly. The entire forest plunged into a dead, absolute silence that felt far more terrifying than the noise. It was a silence that suggested awareness and immediate withdrawal. My light scanned the ground, the wall, the base of the trees. I didn't see a person, an animal, or anything that could explain the sound. The ground beneath the window was covered in thick, damp moss and a uniform carpet of untouched pine needles. There were no footprints. I was about to dismiss it as a strange thermal noise when my light beam caught a detail on the actual wooden planks covering the window. They were old and rough, but running down the front of the planks, clearly visible under the porch light, were 3 long, perfectly vertical and wet streaks. The liquid was clear, but the streaks were distinct, looking like slow, steady lines of clear liquid had trickled down the wood from the top edge. The air was dead calm, and there had been no rain for days. The moisture was fresh. I backed away, closed the door quietly, and locked it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I spent the next few hours sitting rigidly in the living room chair, gripping the poker. Then, I heard a different sound, a soft, low whispering noise coming from the bedroom. My bedroom was right next to the wall with the boarded window. I walked slowly toward the bedroom door. The whispering was distinct now, an unnerving, rhythmic, sibilant sound, like dry air being pushed through very small gaps. It sounded like an attempt at speech, but pitched too high and too quiet to be understood. I slowly reached the door and pushed it open. The bedroom was dark, cold, and smelled of old cedar. I aimed my flashlight at the wall of the boarded window. The sound was coming directly from that wall. I walked right up to the curtains and pulled them back with a quick, nervous motion. And that's when I saw the true horror of that window. The inside pane of glass wasn't just there. It was covered with a thick, uniform layer of dark, fine material, like dried mud or very fine dirt, completely obscuring the view of the external boards. And running across the interior surface of that dirty glass, visible in my focused flashlight beam, were 3 long, slow trails of condensation, exactly matching the wet streaks I saw on the exterior wood. It was like something large and warm was pressed against the other side, slowly fogging the glass as it breathed. The final horrifying detail broke my sanity. The rhythmic whispering noise was caused by a small, perfectly circular hole that had been drilled through the glass and the fine dirt, directly in the center of the window. The hole was no larger than a keyhole, and from it, A cold, metallic-smelling gust of air was escaping into the room, creating the rhythmic, high-pitched whispering sound. I realized the tapping hadn't been on the window. It had been the sound of a drill bit slowly, laboriously punching through the thick glass and the external boards. The tapping stopped when I turned on the porch light because whoever was outside had finally finished their work and had just created their opening. The moisture was just the condensation from their hot breath against the cold glass. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on that tiny black circle in the center of the glass. The airflow and the whispering sound were steady now, relentless. I didn't wait to see if the hole would grow larger or what would reach through it. I grabbed my keys and the few boxes I had packed, and I drove out of the forest, abandoning the rest of the property. I told the family friend the house was completely unfit for sale and never returned to those woods. I don't know who boarded that window shut decades ago, or why they kept it a secret, but I suspect they knew that something out in that black forest was simply waiting for the silence of the night to finally drill its way in. This happened a few years ago, not long after I started university. We were on the kind of road trip that felt both boring and urgent at the same time. 3 of us, my friend Liam, his older sister Chloe, and I were driving from our quiet hometown back to campus after a long holiday break. We had pushed the drive late, hoping to avoid the heavy Sunday traffic, which meant we found ourselves on a small, isolated state highway cutting through a remote agricultural region around 3 a.m. The sheer loneliness of the highway was overwhelming. Liam was sound asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window, and Chloe was driving, surviving on lukewarm energy drinks. The night was pitch black, and the road was perfectly straight for miles, lined on both sides by endless, dark, whispering rows of corn. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and late-season harvest, a heavy, vegetal perfume that made the car feel like a sealed bubble. That's when Chloe noticed the turnoff. It wasn't a proper highway exit marked with signs or mile markers. It was a wide, unmarked dirt road that simply peeled off the shoulder, a crude gash that disappeared abruptly into the dense cornfields. What made it stand out was the anomaly of light. About 100 yards down the dirt path, there was a single, powerful amber street lamp, casting a strange, sickly yellow glow over the tops of the corn stalks. It was completely out of place. "That's weird," Chloe murmured, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by curiosity. "That road isn't on the map, and why on earth is there a working street lamp out here? There isn't a house for 10 miles. It was the kind of impulsive, late-night decision born of fatigue and boredom. We had been driving for 8 hours, and the sight of an unexplained light was too much of a curiosity to pass up. Chloe slowed the car, checking her mirrors instinctively, even though we hadn't seen another vehicle in over 20 minutes. She turned the car onto the dirt road. The moment we left the asphalt, the crunching sound of the tires on the dry, coarse dirt was immediately loud and overwhelming, shattering the previous silence of the night like glass. We drove slowly, the headlights bouncing nervously off the dense corn stalks. The stalks were easily taller than the car, forming a complete, oppressive wall on both sides. It felt like we had entered a narrow, vertical maze with no visibility beyond the next 10 feet. When we finally reached the amber street lamp, we saw what it was illuminating: a small, paved turnaround area and an old, heavy steel gate that was permanently welded shut. The gate was completely useless. It wasn't locking anything in or out. It was simply a barrier to a dead end. Its purpose was defunct, or perhaps symbolic. Just beyond the gate, set back maybe 50 feet into the field, was a low, featureless concrete building with no windows. It was solid, blocky, and completely anonymous, looking like an old irrigation pump house or a rural communication station from the Cold War era. The only thing of note was a single wide metal pipe that jutted horizontally out of the side of the concrete structure and disappeared directly into the dark. Ambience. We stopped the car, and Chloe killed the engine. The resulting silence returned, heavier and thicker than before, broken only by a faint, low hissing sound that seemed to emanate directly from the ground near the concrete structure. It sounded like air escaping slowly from a deep underground pressure valve. Liam jolted awake, disoriented. What is this place? It feels wrong. Like we just drove into a soundstage. Chloe confirmed his feeling. I'm going to take a picture of the gate before we leave. This is too strange not to document. We all got out of the car. The air here was noticeably colder than on the highway, and the pervasive smell of ozone was sharp, almost metallic, cutting through the scent of the corn. As Chloe walked toward the gate with her phone, Liam and I stood near the back of the car, looking intently at the concrete building. I noticed something on the roof of the building, which was flat and covered with dark tar paper. Lying flat on the dark surface, barely visible in the amber light, were two identical white objects. They were about the size of dinner plates, smooth and circular, looking startlingly like porcelain dishes left out to dry. "Hey, look up there," I whispered, pointing to the roof. "Are those plates? Why would plates be on the roof of a communication shack?" Liam squinted, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "That's insane. Maybe some locals use this spot for late-night parties?" As we spoke, one of the white circles, the one closest to the corner of the building, slowly rotated. It didn't roll. It pivoted silently, turning about 90 degrees on its axis, and then stopped with a small, precise, mechanical click sound that was audible over the quiet hiss. A wave of profound, immediate fear hit us both. We knew instantly those were not plates. They were not left behind by people. They were active, control devices. We were not alone, and those things had just acknowledged our presence. Chloe heard the metallic click and hurried back from the gate. Her face was pale. "We need to leave right now. I don't know what it is, but I feel like we shouldn't be here. It's too quiet." Just as she reached us, the entire concrete building emitted a loud, sharp metallic grinding sound that echoed deafeningly off the corn walls. The sound lasted for maybe 3 seconds, starting low and escalating to a piercing shriek, and then stopped as suddenly as it began. It sounded like a massive gear being forcibly turned deep beneath the structure. We didn't need any more convincing. We scrambled back into the car, slamming the doors shut with a violent chorus of thuds. Chloe frantically fumbled the key into the ignition. "Look at the ground," Liam yelled, his voice tight with pure panic, pointing a shaking finger at the windshield. My headlights were shining directly on the patch of dirt where the metal pipe went into the ground. When we had arrived, the dirt around the pipe was flat and dry. Now, it was dark and freshly disturbed. And running from that spot, straight toward the back of our car, was a very shallow, perfectly straight track in the loose soil, as if something narrow and rigid had just been pulled quickly and firmly from the ground beneath. The hissing noise immediately intensified, growing louder and shifting into a slow, sustained sucking sound, emanating directly from the area where the pipe met the earth. It sounded like the building was drawing a deep, slow breath. Chloe got the engine started, threw it into reverse, and backed up quickly. As she did, I looked in the side mirror and saw the steel gate rushing past. The gate was still welded shut, but now, woven tightly through the bars of the gate, were numerous long, incredibly thin strands of dark, thread-like material. They were moving slightly, swaying in the sudden draft of our car, and they looked exactly like freshly pulled roots or vines, but they had a distinct, unnatural sheen that looked metallic. They were searching the air. We accelerated onto the main highway, leaving a massive rooster tail of dirt and dust behind us. We drove for miles without speaking, the only sound the frantic thump of our hearts. When we finally stopped at a brightly lit gas station an hour later, the sun was starting to cast a pale gray light on the horizon. Chloe was shaking too much to pump gas, so I got out to do it. I checked the back of the car while I was waiting for the pump. There, stuck firmly to the rear bumper, was one of those thread-like metallic roots. It was thick and coarse, and it was broken off cleanly. It hadn't fallen off. It had been snapped. And clinging to the severed end of the root, stuck fast to the bumper, was a small, dense, wet clump of black soil. We immediately paid and drove out of the state, throwing the root out the window 100 miles later. We never talked about that rest stop again, not in any real detail. I realized that the concrete building wasn't an abandoned pump house. It was an active station, and those turning plates weren't sensors. They were directional guides. And whatever they were growing out there in the dark cornfields was not a crop. It was an elaborate, biomechanical network that knew exactly how to reach out, tag, and take a sample from an unwelcome visitor. We drove onto its territory, and it collected its price. This happened a few years ago when my friends and I were just out of high school. I was crashing with two friends, Mark and Jenna, in a small, ridiculously cheap rental house near the coast of Oregon. We were all broke, working seasonal jobs, and the house itself was a sprawling old fixer-upper with a huge, completely unkempt yard that looked like a forgotten tangle of blackberry bushes and dead grass. It was charmingly dilapidated, full of character, but it had one truly bizarre architectural quirk that quickly became the source of our deepest, most lasting terror. The house was 2 stories, but the second floor only spanned half the length of the building. The quirk was in the living room, which had an unusually high cathedral ceiling that vaulted up into the darkness. Standing at the far end of this room, you could look straight up and see the entire underside of the second floor hallway, supported by thick, raw, exposed wooden beams. It looked exactly like a long, narrow wooden box, a massive, silent coffin floating 20 feet above the main living area. This floating section was separated from the main house downstairs by a thick, dark layer of asbestos board stapled to the underside of the floor joists. It was the old owner's attempt at fireproofing, and it made the entire elevated space feel even more like a disconnected, heavy box. The only way to access it was a single, narrow, steep staircase tucked around a corner near the kitchen. We referred to the entire structure as the box. One rainy Friday night, we were all sitting downstairs in the living room, trying to watch a cheesy action movie, when we heard a sound come from that floating hallway above us. It was a single, distinct dragging noise, loud and unmistakable, like a heavy piece of furniture with a rough base being pulled slowly and laboriously across the bare hardwood floor. The sound was slow and purposeful. We all froze, the movie completely forgotten. Mark nudged my arm hard. "Did you hear that?" The landlady swore the house was entirely cleared out when she bought it. Empty for 3 years. We knew the second floor was completely cleared out, save for dust, dead bugs, and cobwebs. Jenna grabbed the nearest window curtain and peered out. We checked the outside. All the doors and windows were locked, secured with old, heavy bolts. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without smashing glass, and we hadn't heard a sound. We tried to rationalize it, deciding it was just the wind or the ancient foundation settling. We restarted the movie. About 10 minutes later, the sound came again, but this time it was different and infinitely worse. It was a rhythmic, low-thudding sound, slow and incredibly heavy, like someone was methodically and deliberately dropping a solid, non-bouncing object onto the wooden floor of that elevated hallway. Thud, thud, thud. The spacing between the sounds was unnervingly precise. Jenna scrambled for the light switch, illuminating the living room in a harsh glare. We all looked up into the gloom of the high ceiling, staring intently at the dark, flat underside of the floating room. The thudding was clearly coming from directly above us, right in the center of the structure. "That is definitely someone up there," Mark whispered, his face pale, grabbing a heavy, leather-bound dictionary from the shelf. "I'm going to check the staircase." We have to know. We followed him nervously, adrenaline cutting through our exhaustion. The staircase was incredibly narrow and creaked horribly with every single step. As we climbed, the thudding stopped abruptly. By the time we reached the top landing, the hallway was silent, the silence amplified by the sudden exertion of our climb. The floating hallway was dimly lit by a single dirty window at the far end. The entire floor was coated in years of fine gray dust and plaster debris. There was absolutely no one there. No footprints, no open doors, and no sign of forced entry. We walked the entire dusty length, searching under the eaves and in the two small, shallow closets. We found nothing, but we all noticed a strong, distinct smell of hot metal and electrical ozone, a smell that certainly didn't belong in a house that old and disconnected. As we were about to turn back, utterly bewildered, Jenna noticed a detail on the floor. Running along the center of the hallway floor, perfectly straight from one end to the other, was a faint, thin black line. It looked like it had been drawn with a permanent, fine-tip marker. "What is this?" Jenna asked, kneeling down and carefully running her finger across the line. We examined it closely. The line started right at the edge of the stair landing and ran the entire length of the hallway, stopping abruptly just before the window. It was too straight, too dark, and too continuous to be an accidental scuff mark or a crack in the wood. It was placed with an unsettling precision. We shrugged it off as the eccentricity of the previous owner. We descended the stairs, and the very moment my foot touched the bottom step, the dragging noise started again, this time instantly and louder, coming from the floating room above. We ran back into the living room and looked up into the ceiling's vault. The dragging sound was accompanied by a new, horrifying element. A low, resonant humming noise that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room, making our teeth feel slightly loose. We knew we had to investigate closer. Mark ran to the kitchen and grabbed a folding ladder we use for painting high ceilings. We set it up directly under the floating room, right where the loudest part of the noise seemed to be centered. I climbed the ladder, holding my powerful flashlight up to the dark asbestos board. The humming noise was now a frantic, high-pitched whine directly above the board. As my light hit the asbestos, I saw why the previous owner had sealed it so thickly. Near the center, the board was visibly swollen and warped, pushed downward as if a massive, concentrated weight had been pressing on the floor above it for years. Then I saw the chilling confirmation. Running across the warped section, burned directly into the asbestos, was the same thin black line we had seen on the hallway floor. It wasn't marker. It was a score track that had been burned straight through the thick, fireproof material. As I stared, horrified, the whining noise intensified, reaching a painful, unbearable pitch, and I heard a new, distinct sound from directly above, a series of fast, furious metallic clicks, like rapid, frantic gears engaging and disengaging. The whole floating room creaked violently. A sudden shower of old dust, dried insulation, and flakes of asbestos rained down on me. I screamed and scrambled down the ladder, hitting the floor hard. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran for the front door, leaving the lights on and the movie still playing, and stood shivering in the driveway, staring back at the dark house. From inside, we heard a final terrifying sequence of sounds. The high-pitched whining stopped, instantly replaced by a low, powerful thrumming vibration that rattled the windows even from the driveway. The entire floating room shuddered once, violently, and then a section of the wood above the main living room emitted a loud, splitting crack sound that signaled total structural failure. We realized the second-floor structure wasn't simply old. It was never designed to hold the weight or the movement of whatever was traveling along that tracked line. The previous owner hadn't just used the asbestos to prevent fire, they had sealed the bottom to prevent whatever was in that room from falling through onto the main living area. We never went back inside. We called the landlady, reported a structural collapse, and left the town that very same night, abandoning our seasonal jobs and our security deposits. I don't know what that black line was for, or what massive, motorized object was moving along its track, but I realized that room wasn't floating. It was being held separate as a cage, and whatever was inside was finally attempting to move off its designated, controlled path. The whole thing happened a few years ago. I was driving alone across the vast, empty expanse of the Mojave Desert, heading east, trying to make good time and stay ahead of a major weather system. My gas gauge was dipping close to empty, and I needed to find a station fast. I saw a faded sign for a small town and pulled off the interstate onto an old, forgotten two-lane highway, the asphalt cracked and shimmering in the heat. Eventually, through the evening haze, I saw a cluster of pale, yellowish lights in the distance. I drove toward them and found myself entering a tiny, intensely isolated town nestled right in a massive, shallow valley. The town sign was barely legible, faded and sun-bleached. It read, Vale, followed by a population count of 127, spray-painted over and clearly outdated by decades. The town itself was a strange collection of run-down, identical wooden houses and a single derelict main street. The gas station was the oldest thing I'd ever seen, completely closed, its pump handles bagged in yellow plastic. I stopped anyway, pulling into the cracked, dusty lot, hoping at least for an old payphone or someone I could flag down for directions to the next county. The moment I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, I was hit by an overwhelming, painful sensory experience. The town was deafeningly loud. I don't mean traffic or the sound of industry. I mean the very air was full of an all-consuming, powerful whine that seemed to vibrate the pavement beneath my shoes. This high-frequency sound was mixed with a rapid, chaotic, rattling noise, not metal hitting metal, but something brittle, like thousands of tiny, empty soda cans or gravel being dragged across a sidewalk at high speed. It was a cacophony of disorganized white noise that instantly made my teeth ache and my head throb. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't external and directional. It felt like it was originating from within the structure of the town itself, echoing through the ground and up through my bones. I tried to look around, despite the pain. Despite the impossible racket, every single house was completely dark. No porch lights, no interior lamps, no parked cars, and no signs of life. Not a flapping curtain or a discarded toy. It was a ghost town, but a very, very loud one, locked in a state of perpetual vibrating alarm. I forced myself to walk past the abandoned station and found an old, rusted public notice board struggling to hold onto its bolts. I saw a faded peeling flyer tacked to it. The text was blurred by weather, but by pressing my face close, I could make out a few key, chilling phrases. Annual town meeting, notice regarding sound ordinance compliance, and, printed in heavier block letters, the schedule. The rest was just incomprehensible rules and times. As I was squinting at the illegible text, trying to determine what kind of sound ordinance they could possibly have, I heard a different noise that abruptly cut through the chaos. It was a low, resonant humming sound that was rapidly escalating in pitch, coming from the ground directly beneath my feet. The pavement vibrated sharply, tingling the soles of my shoes. I looked down. The asphalt was cracked and riddled with potholes, but right near the curb, I saw a single small, circular manhole cover made of old, heavy cast iron. The high-pitched humming was coming from directly beneath it, a desperate, pressurized noise. My instinct screamed danger. I immediately ran back to my car, got inside, and frantically locked the doors. The thick glass helped only slightly, dampening the overall volume, but the intense, internal vibration of the pavement continued to travel up through the chassis and into my seat. I sat there, watching the manhole cover in the failing light. The high-pitched humming reached a peak of painful intensity, sounding like a kettle about to explode, and then stopped instantly. The chaotic whine and rattling of the town continued unabated, mocking the silence from the ground. But then, the manhole cover began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to rotate on its axis, grinding a soft, low squeal against the concrete rim. It turned for a full 90 degrees, taking an agonizing minute to complete the rotation. As it turned, I saw something carved into the freshly exposed side of the cover, the side that had been resting on the rim. There were a series of geometric symbols carved into the heavy metal, crude but deliberate, looking like ancient letters or angular runes that had been polished smooth by years of friction. The manhole cover stopped rotating with a soft, final scritch sound. There was a moment of heavy stillness, and then a new, unmistakable sound. The hissing sound of hydraulics being released, followed by a low, mechanical clunk from deep beneath the earth. Then, the powerful whine and rattling that had defined the town for the last 15 minutes stopped completely. The sudden, total silence was more shocking and infinitely more terrifying than the noise had been. The silence was absolute, heavy, and immediate, pressing in on the car, making my ears ring painfully from the vacuum of sound. I realized the chaos of the town wasn't just noise. It was a perpetual acoustic barrier, a blanket of white noise designed to keep people away, or maybe to keep something inside from hearing the outside world. And whatever had just moved the manhole cover had just turned the sound off according to the schedule. I looked up, scanning the town in the sudden, eerie silence, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. At the end of the main street, where the road entered the fields again, stood a figure. It was tall and slender, standing utterly motionless in the middle of the road. It wore a long, dark coat that entirely obscured its shape, and it was facing my direction. Its posture was unnaturally rigid. Then, from the darkness of the surrounding houses, the houses that had been completely silent and dark, two more figures emerged, moving slowly and deliberately out of the shadows and taking up positions behind the first one. They stood in a perfectly spaced, silent line, and they were all looking straight at my car. And then I heard a sound that confirmed I was no longer an observer. It was a clear, distinct, faint tapping noise, coming from the pavement directly under the driver's side floorboard. It was a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, like something very light striking the asphalt, directly beneath where my feet were resting. I immediately jammed the key and cranked the engine. The sound of the starter was a gunshot in the absolute silence, and the car roared to life, violently breaking the acoustic spell. As the engine caught, the three figures began to move together, not running, but gliding slowly and deliberately toward my car, their long coats flowing. They made no sound at all on the pavement. I slammed the transmission into drive and sped out of that town, never looking in the rearview mirror until I hit the interstate, miles away. When I finally reached the reassuring, chaotic noise of the highway traffic, the relief was physical, like escaping a vacuum chamber. I realized that the town of Vale wasn't noisy. It was broadcasting a perpetual acoustic signal to discourage intrusion. And when the schedule required, that signal was briefly silenced, leaving the town open for those who were finally ready to listen or to collect. I took a short-term job a few years ago that involved surveying remote land in the high desert of Arizona. It was hot, dusty work, but the pay was good, and the intense solitude was its own reward. My specific task was to check boundary markers on a vast, privately owned ranch, miles from any main road or town. It was the kind of place where you could drive for an hour and not see another living thing. One afternoon, I was driving my ATV across a huge, empty stretch of flat land covered in low scrub brush and pale, dry grass. The heat was radiating off the ground, and the horizon was so distant it felt like I was driving into a void. I stopped to check my GPS against the boundary fences. That's when I noticed the stones. About 100 yards ahead of me, the landscape abruptly changed. The scrub brush stopped dead, replaced by a massive, perfectly flat field of dark gray stones. These weren't random boulders. They were uniform river stones, all about the size of a fist, completely covering the ground. The difference between the wild desert and this patch was jarring. What made it truly chilling was the geometry. The field was a perfect, immense circle, maybe a half-mile in diameter. The edge where the scrub brush met the stones was a flawless, razor-sharp line. And within the circle, the stones were arranged in a rigid, repeating pattern of concentric rings and radial spokes that started at the center and moved outwards. It was complex, enormous, and absolutely impossible to have occurred naturally. It looked like a vast, silent, metallic circuit board laid into the earth. I had to investigate. I killed the ATV engine and walked up to the edge. The air immediately felt strangely heavier, almost pressurized, and the scent of ozone was sharp and metallic. The constant, low whistling sound of the desert wind, which had been a perpetual companion, seemed to vanish the moment my feet touched the first stones. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of the hot sun beating down. I walked a few paces into the field, careful to maintain my balance on the tightly packed surface. The pattern was incredible. Each stone was fitted tightly against its neighbors, and they were all positioned with the same smooth, dark side facing up. It was a testament to impossible, tireless labor. I looked toward the absolute center of the formation, about a quarter-mile away. There was no monument or structure, just a small, slightly darker patch where the geometric pattern seemed to culminate. I started walking toward the center, following the precise line of one of the stone-lined spokes. As I walked, I realized two things about the stones. They were not just uniform in size. They were also unusually cold. The desert sun was beating down fiercely, but the stones beneath my boots were icy to the touch, conducting coldness from deep underground. When I reached the center patch, I stopped. The stones here were smaller, darker, and slightly sunken. In the exact middle of the entire formation, there was a single, tiny, perfectly square depression in the ground, about the size of a shoebox, and it was empty. The entire massive structure was built to frame this small, missing element. I heard a sound then. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking noise that seemed to come from the ground all around me. It was not loud, but omnipresent. A precise click, click, click like thousands of tiny, unseen, internal mechanisms or gears engaging simultaneously in the earth beneath the stones. I spun around, scanning the huge geometric field. I was completely exposed, standing in the heart of this impossible formation. That's when I saw the ripple. About 50 feet away, running across the tight surface of the stones, was a visible wave of movement. The stones weren't rolling randomly. They were shuffling, moving slightly against each other in a coordinated wave that ran along one of the perfect concentric rings, traveling silently and relentlessly toward the square center where I stood. It was an unnerving, fluid motion, like a vast, gray, scaled skin drawing itself inward. The rhythmic clicking intensified, becoming a frantic chattering sound. The ground beneath my boots began to vibrate with a low, powerful thrumming resonance that I could feel moving up through my spine. I stared at the approaching ripple, horrified, realizing that the entire field of stones was not static. It was acting as a single, enormous, pre-programmed mechanism. I looked down at the empty, square hole beneath my feet. Whatever belonged there was missing, and the entire structure was correcting itself, attempting to close the gap and rebuild the perfect pattern, treating me like the only variable. I didn't wait to see what would happen when the shifting wave of stones reached the center. I sprinted out of the stone field as fast as I could run, scrambling over the tightly packed, cold surface. The moment my feet hit the natural desert scrub, the organized thrumming and chattering instantly stopped. The only sound was the familiar, rough, whistling sound of the desert wind, rushing back into the acoustic vacuum. I turned back, gasping for breath. The stone field was motionless, rigid, and perfect again. The edge where the stones met the scrub was still a razor-sharp line, but now, a new detail was chillingly apparent. Right at the edge of the field, precisely where I had stood moments ago, a small section of stones was piled high, a perfect, overflowing mound of dark river rock. The pattern had been completed, the small square hole was now filled, but the material displaced by my hasty intrusion had nowhere to go but up. The system had accounted for my mass. I jumped on the ATV and sped away, checking my rearview mirror constantly. I never reported the formation. I realized that the field of stones wasn't an ancient artifact or an art installation. It was a vast geometric inventory that maintained its own perfect count, and the entire structure had reacted to my presence as an error that needed to be resolved.